The moment you realize that nothing digital you paid for actually belongs to you is the moment the modern world stops looking like progress and starts looking like a carefully managed cage. In the years after 2020, the quiet tightening of control over what ordinary people can access, store, and even discuss accelerated faster than most were willing to admit. Payment networks erased thousands of games from major storefronts because the content no longer fit a corporate brand image. Age verification and digital identity requirements began appearing on ordinary information pages that had nothing to do with restricted material. And major companies announced the end of physical media so that every film, every game, and every piece of software would live only on servers they controlled. By the time this conversation is finished, you will understand why the people who see this trajectory clearly often end up exhausted, isolated in their preparations, and still convinced that the alternative of continued dependence is even worse. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos, you can show support by clicking the join button below and becoming a channel member to show support and gain access to exclusive videos for channel members only. The fracture did not arrive with a single dramatic announcement. It arrived in pieces that looked technical and temporary at the time. One day, a payment processor decided certain titles were unsuitable for its brand, and thousands of games vanished from digital storefronts overnight. Another day, platforms began requiring identity verification simply to read certain encyclopedia entries about historical events or scientific topics. Physical media production was wound down by large entertainment companies so that ownership itself became a subscription relationship that could be altered or revoked at any moment. Each change was defended as necessary, protective, or simply the direction of progress, yet the cumulative effect was the same. The infrastructure that delivered entertainment, information, and communication remained under the control of entities whose interests were not aligned with the people using it. When the servers change policy, when the payment networks revise their risk models, when the operating system vendor decides an update will remove features or introduce new restrictions, the user discovers that the copies he believed he owned were only temporary licenses. That discovery is sobering because it reveals how little actual control most people retain over the digital tools and media that fill their daily lives. The rational response is not panic or conspiracy thinking. The rational response is to stop treating rented infrastructure as permanent and to begin constructing systems that remain usable even when external services change the rules or disappear entirely. Reclaiming control begins with the operating systems that sit between the user and the hardware. Stock consumer operating systems are designed for convenience and continuous connectivity, which also means they are designed for continuous oversight and remote modification. Moving to systems that prioritize local authority changes the relationship. On a laptop or desktop, this means adopting distributions that allow full administrative access, transparent package management, and the ability to refuse updates that introduce unwanted behavior. On a mobile device, it means using hardened forks that strip out the constant data collection and remote management features that ordinary phones accept as normal. The goal is not purity or ideological perfection. The goal is practical ownership of the machine itself so that no distant company can decide what software is allowed to run, what data must be reported, or when a device becomes unsupported. Once that foundation is in place, the next layer is storage and local services. A personal network attached storage system ceases to be a simple backup drive and becomes the core of a private infrastructure. Media servers can stream films, series, and music directly from drives the owner controls. ROM libraries covering decades of console history can be organized, scanned, and made available to any device on the network or reachable through secure remote access. Offline knowledge archives can hold entire encyclopedias, technical documentation, and reference works so that information remains available when search engines alter results or when connectivity is restricted. Each of these pieces is modest on its own. Together, they form an environment in which entertainment, learning, and communication no longer depend on the continued goodwill of external platforms. Data hoarding in this context is not nostalgia or excess. It is a recognition that access can be withdrawn and that formats can be abandoned. When physical media production ends, the only copies that remain under user control are the ones already in hand or already digitized and stored locally. When digital storefronts remove titles, the only playable versions are the ones previously acquired and preserved. When encyclopedias or documentation sites begin requiring identity checks or alter content for contemporary sensitivities, the offline snapshot remains readable without negotiation. The people who build these collections are often the same people who speak of urgency when they demonstrate new tools or configurations. They understand that preparation is never finished because the external environment continues to change. New restrictions appear, old formats are deprecated, and storage media themselves degrade. The work of verification, redundancy, and migration therefore becomes continuous. Hard drives fail, file systems need checking, catalogs need updating, emulators require maintenance as host operating systems evolve. The labor is real and it compounds. The more systems one brings under personal control, the more surfaces require ongoing attention. That is the price of options. Dependence on external services feels lighter day to day because the maintenance is performed by someone else. Yet that lightness disappears the moment the service alters its terms or ceases to exist. Local ownership feels heavier because the owner must perform the maintenance, yet the systems remain usable on the owner's terms. The exhaustion that follows is not theoretical. Time that once went into ordinary content consumption or casual creation is absorbed by the cycle of backup, verification, documentation, and expansion. Awareness of how much remains undone grows with every completed task. A single media server becomes a cluster. A single offline encyclopedia becomes a library of specialized collections. A simple remote access tool becomes a mesh of secure tunnels and fallback communication methods. Each addition increases resilience and simultaneously increases the surface that must be monitored. The result is a different kind of cage. The first cage was dependence on platforms that could change the rules without consent. The second cage is the unending requirement to stay ahead of those changes. Many who enter this path deliberately reduce their intake of external information precisely because the preparation work already consumes so much attention. Feeds are stripped of recommendations, thumbnails, and algorithmic suggestions. Only a narrow set of sources is allowed through, chosen for technical usefulness rather than emotional intensity. World events are left unexamined unless they directly affect the systems being maintained. The choice is not ignorance for its own sake, it is prioritization. Attention is finite. Every hour spent absorbing distant drama is an hour not spent verifying backups, refining configurations, or documenting solutions so that the same problem never has to be solved twice. Reducing dependency extends beyond digital systems into the material conditions of daily life. Debt creates ongoing obligations to external parties and therefore creates leverage those parties can use. Clearing obligations removes that leverage. Consumer products that rely on proprietary formulations or continuous supply chains create quiet points of failure. Shifting toward simpler formulations made from ordinary ingredients reduces the number of external links that must remain intact. Redundancy becomes a guiding principle. Storage arrays are mirrored so that a single drive failure does not erase years of work. Communication methods are multiplied so that the loss of one network does not isolate the user. Knowledge is recorded in durable local formats so that the understanding required to maintain the systems does not reside only in memory or in online tutorials that may vanish. The same logic applies to larger questions of place and shelter. Renting indefinitely means remaining subject to decisions made by landlords, municipalities, and currency authorities whose interest may diverge from the renters. Owning property, even if that property is located in a different jurisdiction and managed at a distance, creates an option that cannot be revoked by a single local policy change. The property does not have to be a primary residence. It only has to exist as a fallback that belongs to the owner rather than to a landlord. Options of this kind are imperfect. They can still be lost through force or legal process. They nevertheless differ from pure dependence in one decisive respect. The owner retains the ability to act rather than merely to request. Knowledge itself is the most portable form of ownership. Skills acquired while configuring one system transfer to the next. Understanding of fundamental operating system concepts makes new distributions and hardened mobile systems easier to evaluate and maintain. Experience with local media servers and remote access tools makes larger home environments manageable. Documentation practices that treat personal notes as a durable second brain prevent the same troubleshooting cycle from being repeated endlessly. Offline language models and image generation tools remove the need to send every query or creative request to external services that can change their terms or introduce new identity requirements. Each layer of competence compounds. The person who once needed constant external guidance becomes capable of diagnosing and repairing an expanding range of failures without leaving the local environment. That competence cannot be revoked by a terms of service update. It travels with the individual. It also changes the relationship to information. When the same knowledge base is stored locally and cross referenced through simple structured notes, the owner is no longer dependent on search rankings or platform recommendations to locate what he already learned. The second brain becomes both archive and amplifier. The deeper pattern is the rejection of single points of failure across every domain that matters. Digital media, communication channels, financial obligations, physical shelter, and personal knowledge are all examined for hidden dependencies and then systematically provided with alternatives. The work is never declared finished because the external environment continues to evolve. New restrictions appear. Old formats age. Hardware eventually fails. The preparation continues. The sobering recognition is that freedom in this sense is not a destination that can be reached and then enjoyed without further effort. It is a continuous practice of reducing exposure to external control while accepting the labor that residual control still requires. Those who undertake the practice often find themselves speaking less about distant events and more about the concrete systems in front of them. They limit the voices allowed into their attention because every additional input competes with the work of maintenance and expansion. They accept a degree of isolation as the price of not remaining fully inside systems whose rules can change without their consent. The alternative is to continue renting every layer of digital and material life and to hope that the landlords of those layers remain benevolent. History offers little reason for that hope to be durable. The only reliable path is the slower, heavier one of constructing and maintaining one's own infrastructure so that when the next set of rules changes, the response is already prepared. The continuous practice of removing single points of failure eventually forces a confrontation with the architecture of daily media and knowledge itself. Local media servers stop being optional conveniences and become the primary method of delivery once the owner accepts that external catalogs can be altered or withdrawn without notice. A properly configured system can present films, series, and animation in an interface that feels familiar yet remains entirely under local control, with libraries organized, scraped, and refreshed according to the owner's own standards rather than the shifting priorities of remote platforms. Music follows the same pattern. Streaming services that once felt permanent can revise their catalogs, raise prices, or insert identity checks, while a dedicated local music server pulls tracks directly from drives. The owner maintains and delivers them to any device on the network with higher fidelity and none of the external tracking. Knowledge archives push the principle further. Entire encyclopedias, technical manuals, and reference collections can be downloaded, indexed, and stored offline so that information remains readable even when connectivity is limited or when external sources begin requiring verification for ordinary historical or scientific pages. The labor of keeping these collections current is real, yet the alternative is permanent reliance on systems whose operators have already demonstrated the willingness to remove access when it suits them. Preservation of interactive media follows the same logic and quickly expands into its own discipline. Console libraries spanning decades can be organized under a central manager that handles metadata, cover art, and version tracking, then made available to any device the owner chooses to use. Games can be pulled on demand to a laptop, a handheld, or a secondary machine, played with the local processing power of that device, and have their save data returned automatically to the central store. Secure remote access tools allow the same libraries to be reached from outside the home network without exposing the systems to the open internet. The result is that a person can travel or change locations and still retain the ability to play titles acquired years earlier without depending on the continued operation of any particular corporate storefront. Higher generation titles remain more demanding, which is why the next stage of infrastructure often involves more powerful storage and compute hardware capable of streaming those games directly rather than transferring them. The progression is incremental. Each completed layer reveals the next limitation and the next set of tools required to overcome it. The work is never declared complete because the external environment continues to deprecate formats, alter licensing, and raise the barrier to ordinary access. Technical understanding compounds in ways that are difficult to reverse once the process begins. Competence with one family of operating systems makes the evaluation and maintenance of hardened mobile systems more straightforward. Experience configuring local servers and secure remote access translates into the ability to manage larger environments without constant external guidance. Command line fluency, acquired while administering one machine, transfers to others, including systems that share a, a common underlying design, even when their surface interfaces look different. Documentation practices turn temporary solutions into permanent reference material. Notes written in a structured local format become a second brain that can be searched, linked, and expanded over years so that the same troubleshooting cycle does not have to be repeated. Offline language models and image generation tools remove the need to transmit every research query or creative request to external services that may later impose identity requirements or alter their terms. The owner begins to treat intelligence itself as something that can be partially localized. The more of these capabilities reside under personal control, the less any single external change can disrupt the ability to work, learn, or create. Language and allowable speech form another layer of infrastructure that is rarely examined until its restrictions become obvious. Observations made decades ago noted that controlling the words people are permitted to use eventually limits the thoughts they are able to form. When certain expressions disappear from ordinary conversation because they are no longer tolerated in public channels. The underlying concepts become harder to reference and eventually harder to think. Contemporary platforms enforce narrower and narrower boundaries on what may be discussed, particularly around health, current events in other countries, and political questions of any substance. Creators who remain inside those systems learn to stay inside the shrinking garden or risk reduced reach and demonetization. The practical result is that many topics of genuine consequence are simply avoided, not because they lack importance, but because the cost of addressing them exceeds the benefit under the current rules. The people who notice this pattern often respond by reducing their dependence on those channels for both creation and consumption. They limit the voices allowed into their attention, prefer primary technical sources over commentary, and accept that a degree of isolation is preferable to continuous self-censorship. The goal is not to become a hermit. The goal is to prevent external language rules from shaping internal thought. Resilient independent systems offer a concrete demonstration of what ownership of data and audience can achieve. Sites that have survived repeated legal and technical assaults did so because the core data and the community around it were not concentrated in a single controllable location. When one domain or server was removed, mirrors appeared under new addresses within hours. The creators could be pursued, yet the information itself continued to circulate because no single point of failure existed. The lesson is not that every person should replicate that exact model. The lesson is that infrastructure owned and distributed by the people who use it is far harder to extinguish than infrastructure rented from a small number of large operators. The same principle applies at smaller scale. A personal media library, a local knowledge archive, and a set of communication methods that do not depend on any single commercial provider create a margin of independence that cannot be revoked by a policy update or a payment processor decision. Material self sufficiency extends the same thinking into the domain of health and daily provision. Reliance on proprietary formulations and continuous commercial supply chains creates quiet vulnerabilities. Shifting towards simpler products made from ordinary ingredients reduces the number of external links that must remain intact. Learning the properties of common plants and the practical methods of growing them indoors or in limited space further reduces dependence on external medical and commercial systems for routine needs. The knowledge is acquired gradually, tested carefully, and documented locally so that it remains available without requiring continuous external reference. The same mindset that drives the construction of local media servers and offline knowledge bases drives the acquisition of practical skills that keep the body and the household functional when supply chains tighten or when external advice becomes restricted. None of these steps produces perfect independence, they produce options. Options are the difference between being able to respond to a disruption and being forced to accept whatever terms are offered by the remaining providers. Housing and citizenship follow identical logic at larger scale. Continuous renting means remaining subject to decisions made by property owners, local authorities, and currency managers whose interests may diverge from the renters. Acquiring property, even in a different jurisdiction and managed at a distance, creates a fallback that belongs to the owner rather than to a landlord. The property does not need to become a primary residence. It only needs to exist as a place that can be reached and used if local conditions deteriorate. Second citizenship or long term residency options in other countries serve the same purpose. They are not declarations of abandonment. They are deliberate expansions of the set of places where a person can legally stand. The research required is substantial and the process is rarely simple, yet the alternative is to remain permanently inside a single set of rules that can change without consent. People who pursue these options often keep the details private. They understand that announcing every preparation, invites commentary from those who prefer continued dependence and who resent the possibility that someone else might escape it. The cumulative effect of these practices is a life organized around the reduction of external leverage. Debt is cleared where possible because debt creates obligations that can be used as pressure. Consumer products are simplified because proprietary dependencies create points of failure. Digital systems are localized because remote control of media, communication, and knowledge has already been demonstrated. Skills are documented and compounded because knowledge that lives only in memory or on external servers can be lost. Attention is rationed because every hour spent absorbing distant drama is an hour not spent maintaining the systems that provide actual options. The path produces a particular form of exhaustion. The work is never finished. New restrictions appear, hardware ages, formats are deprecated, the preparation continues. Many who walk this road find that their output of public commentary decreases simply because the time required to keep the private infrastructure functional leaves less capacity for continuous content creation. They accept the trade. The alternative is to remain fully inside systems whose operators have already shown the willingness to alter terms, remove access, and narrow the range of permissible speech. The underlying drive is the pursuit of maximum practical freedom. Freedom, in this sense, is not a slogan or a destination that can be reached and then enjoyed without further effort. It is the ongoing capacity to act according to one's own judgment rather than according to the shifting rules of external infrastructure. Achieving that capacity requires ownership of the tools, the data, the skills, and the places that make independent action possible. It requires the willingness to perform the maintenance those systems demand. It requires the acceptance that perfect security does not exist and that the goal is the elimination of single points of failure rather than the elimination of all risk. People who internalize this view often become quieter about distant events and more focused on the concrete systems in front of them. They limit the number of voices allowed to shape their thinking. They treat dependence as a temporary condition to be reduced rather than a permanent state to be managed. They understand that the hardest road is the one that leaves a person with no options when the next set of rules changes. The cost is real and it is paid continuously. Time, attention, and a measure of isolation are the currency. The reward is the residual ability to continue functioning when external systems tighten or fail. That residual ability is what separates those who still have choices from those who must accept whatever terms remain. The work of building and maintaining personal infrastructure is therefore not a hobby or a temporary project. It is the practical expression of the refusal to remain a permanent tenant on someone else's land. Every layer that is brought under local control reduces the leverage that distant operators can apply. Every skill that is documented and compounded increases the capacity to respond without external permission. Every option that is created, whether digital, material, or geographic, expands the set of possible futures that do not depend on the continued benevolence of systems already shown to be capable of sudden restriction. The process never ends because the external environment never stops changing. The only durable response is to keep building the capacity to meet those changes on one's own terms. If you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos, you can show support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. What did you think about what was discussed? Do you agree? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. nothing can compare to crypto.